Our next speaker, Donovan, is part of the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community and strives to be both an advocate for those who experience extreme states and an advocate for human rights. He's a facilitator for Alternatives to Suicide peer support group and has recently been organizing a peer support group for people of diverse experiences of gender, sexuality, and extreme states. He's also got a lot of fans here, apparently. He's one hell of a nice guy. Donovan.
I'm not going to do a cartwheel. Thanks for those of you that can. I wanted to thank everyone for being here. I'm pretty cold. I can imagine a lot of you are too. So thanks for still being here. I also just wanted to share, since we're in good company, that I'm sort of like 5 or 6 weeks into being off drugs entirely. But this is my 3rd try, and I think it's going to be the best one. So, you may see that I'm reading from a paper here, but I'm trying to be as animated as possible. So I hope you're all okay with that. Okay. And I also wanted to say, I'm relying in part on the experiences of all of you here today to fill in the parts that I can't say right now. And also, if you have any questions about what I say today, please ask me. So I was in the hospital twice in this very city, in Hartford, once when I was born and once for psychiatric treatment. Whether both were truly voluntary might be up for some debate. Being born in a hospital, I hear, is a pretty common occurrence among living folks in the United States. That much I can say. Thankfully, I can also say I did not enter the hospital for psychiatric treatment by order of involuntary commitment, though many people I talked to while there certainly had. And although I was there voluntarily, I still had to wait in the emergency room for the better part of a day in extreme discomfort to gain access to that very place. Those experiences in the emergency room and in the hospital for the week that followed made me think, well, I'm here voluntarily, or so one might say, and yet never would I have chosen to be here if I didn't think it was my only choice to death or giving up entirely. And that's a true statement. Although psychiatric hospitals can be places of concentrated pain and hurt, and maybe with occasional relief for some, my experience with biological psychiatry, like I'm sure with many folks who are here today, was demoralizing for years outside of any hospital. I'd already been given the prognosis of a serious mental illness by the time I was 16, and the prospect of lifelong medication and treatment. For me, the hospital experience only underscored these pretty dispiriting things. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. Years after the hospital experience, while working to both disprove that prognosis, some people call it a diagnosis, and to advocate for the rights and dignity of other folks as a peer worker in Western Massachusetts, I heard the painfully recounted experiences of someone whose first journey of many to a psych hospital was certainly more involuntary and violent than my own. He admitted he was acting strange and singing to himself on a main street when he recounted to me that he was approached by by 2 police officers. They proceeded to tackle him to the ground, kick him in the head, handcuff him to be thrown into the cruiser, and was taken to a local jail before any court-ordered commitment. He emphasized 2 other things to me that hurt the most for him, in spite of the horrible police brutality he spoke about. He said that first, they never asked him for his ID to make sure he was the right guy, which might seem funny too. He was acting whatever. And 2, they never read him any Miranda rights or any other sort of rights before he was treated essentially like a criminal at best, or like an animal at worst. And right here today, I have a friend, my man LA, who has gone through similar experiences in this very week in Springfield, although it could be Hartford, of being picked up on the street for acting angry. And I feel like this happens to a lot of people, and I want to acknowledge that it happens even in our very midst this very week. So this other man and I, however, we talked about how being poor without a stable place to live often leads folks who experience extreme states in public to be considered criminals without even the rights afforded to criminals, if you can imagine that.
Right.
So this conversation has stuck with me for what it reveals about mental health and civil rights and human rights. And if you come here to support the human rights and the civil rights of folks labeled with mental illnesses, then I hope you're also here to advocate for the rights of poor folks, whose choices for support are more limited than others. I hope you're here to be an advocate for folks from communities of color, so often politically and economically marginalized, and the targets of racial profiling by the police. And I hope you're here to be an advocate for folks expressing all sorts of genders and sexuality whose rights to live are so contested by so many. And last but not least, if you're here, I hope that you'll be an advocate for those labeled illegal, whose rights as human beings are as devastated by the government and its patriots, and the Patriot Act, as those who are poor and labeled mentally ill. For me, to be a human rights advocate for those labeled mentally ill is to be an advocate for people locked in these vines as well, because these things are not separate. Why was I in the hospital voluntarily when so many others have and continue to be violently committed? Why am I standing here today and not over-medicated to the point of stupor, not in a state hospital or not in a residential program? You might refer to those things I just listed as the things for which I want to advocate for, and yet some of why I'm here today is beyond any of this sociological fate, any of those things. Most of all, striving to be an advocate for human rights on behalf of my own self and others is remembering that being a human being is more than the sum of their parts and what labels them.
Right.
And that psychiatry, for many of us here and elsewhere, has at some time in our lives stolen this very thing from us.
Say it again! Say it again!
This very thing from us.
There you go!
To be less than the sum of our parts, to be less than human, through the use of over-medication, shocks, lobotomy, and demoralization, among other violations. To be reduced to a body without a clear consciousness, and I've been there, to be a body without a soul, to be a body without empathy, to be a body without dreams of a resilient future. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that. So, as we congregate here, as we are congregating here, to oppose bills seeking to create a database of those seeking psychiatric support, and also greatly expanding the uses of force towards involuntarily committing people to treatment, both in community and hospital settings, I want to share with you all a statement by one of North America's greatest champions of human rights, Malcolm X, who I will also share with you since we stand at this Capitol steps, spoke at the Bushnell Theater merely paces from here 50 years ago this year. He said, either you are a citizen or you are not a citizen at all. If you are a citizen, you are free. If you're not a citizen, you are a slave. So I say, let's not allow this country and the state of Connecticut to regress to a point of legally enslaving more people in this predatory system of coercion, force, and treatment. Speak up against these bills and for your own human rights.